So today, the message we have in store is titled King. It's about David. I've never talked about David. All the times I've been preaching, all the years, never
We talk about David all the time.
talked about David. And yes, David was a king, but the message is not entitled King because of who David was. Rather, it's called King because of what David knew. What David knew. See, David was fearless. He was fearless. But why was David fearless? David wasn't the biggest. David wasn't the strongest. David wasn't the best. David was a boy. He was fearless. Goliath was fearless. But that's because Goliath was 9 foot tall and strong. He was fearless. Why was David fearless? What did he know? I think David knew that God can do anything. He knew that. But you know what? Didn't all Israel know that? I mean, they knew that God parted the Red Sea, delivered them from Egypt. The Israelites knew that God can do anything. I think most Christians know that God can do anything. But David knew something else. There was more. David knew what God could do. But David also knew, and don't lose this, David knew what God would do.
Amen.
You want more?
Yeah. Break the
You want more? I want you to get that. I want you to think about that. David knew what God would
That's amazing.
do. And it made him fearless. And what did being fearless get David? Well, he wasn't fearless because he was king. Being king got him the kingdom.
Amen.
He was fearless. He was fearless. And I think God wants all of us to be a little more like David in that regard. Be fearless because of what, not only what God can do, but for what God will do. David started out as a child. He was 13 when we start here in the book of Samuel. On the next slide. Samuel 1, 1 Samuel 16, 1 through 13. We're talking about Samuel. Now Samuel was a prophet, and Saul was king at this point. Saul was the first king Israel ever had. It was Saul. And so Saul was king. Saul lost favor with God. God went to Samuel and said, Samuel, I want you to anoint a new king. Now, since Saul was king, Samuel knew, hey, I've got to do this in secret, otherwise this may not work out so well. So Samuel knew he had to do it in secret, which is where we pick up here. 1 Samuel 16, 1 through 13. Now the Lord said to Samuel, you have mourned long enough for Saul. I have rejected him as king of Israel. So fill your flask with olive oil and go to Bethlehem. Find a man named Jesse who lives there, for I have selected one of his sons to be my king." But Samuel asked, "How can I do that? If Saul hears about it, he will kill me." And he would. "Take a heifer with you," the Lord replied, "and say that you have come to make a sacrifice to the Lord, and invite Jesse to the sacrifice, and I will show you which one of his sons to anoint for me." So Samuel, he did as the Lord instructed. When he arrived at Bethlehem, the elders of the town came trembling to meet him. They all knew who Samuel was. "What's wrong?" they asked. "Do you come in peace?" "Yes," Samuel replied. "I have come to sacrifice for the Lord. Purify yourselves and come with me to the sacrifice." Then Samuel performed the purification rite for Jesse and his sons and invited them to the sacrifice too. When they arrived, Samuel took one look at Eliab and thought, "Surely this is the Lord's anointed." That was Jesse's first child. He was tall, he was large. But the Lord said to Samuel, "Don't judge by his appearance or his height, for I have rejected him. The Lord doesn't see things the way you do." The Lord doesn't see things the way you do. People judge by outward appearance, but the Lord looks.
Amen.
People judge by outward appearance. Goliath was huge, over 9 foot tall. His spearhead weighed 15 pounds. Just a spearhead. It was huge. People judge by appearance, what people look like. From that they say, okay, well, he can accomplish this or he can accomplish that, all based on what he looks like. If that were true, I'd be in trouble. Then Jesse told his son, so Jesse's now taking his sons and bringing them before Samuel, so that Samuel can see them. Abinadab to step forward and walk in front of Samuel, but Samuel said, "This is not the one the Lord has chosen." Next, Jesse summoned Shema, but Samuel said, "Neither is he the one the Lord has chosen." So in the same way, all of Jesse's sons were presented to Samuel. But Samuel said to Jesse, "The Lord has not chosen any of these." And then this next moment must have been embarrassing. Samuel asked, "Are there any more? Do you have any other sons by chance?" And here's the reply. "There is still the youngest, but he's out in the fields watching the sheep and the goats." "Send for him at once," Samuel said. "We will not sit down to eat until he arrives." So Jesse sent for him. He was dark and handsome with beautiful eyes, and the Lord said, "This is the one. Anoint him." So as David stood there among his brothers, Samuel took the flask of oil, olive oil, he had brought, and anointed David with oil, and the Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon David from that day on. Then Samuel returned to Ramah. Interestingly, what you don't see is Samuel ever telling David or Jesse what he had just done. He didn't know. He knew he was anointed, but he didn't know what was going to come. Fearless. He was fearless. Next slide, please. 1 Samuel 17. We pick up now. David's a little older. David was 13 or so when that happened. Now, he's about 15. Couldn't even drive to the battlefield if it were today. 15-year-old boy. 1 Samuel 17, 1 through 27. Now the Philistines mustered their army for battle and camped between Zukah and Judah and Azekah at the Ephes Dammim. Saul countered by gathering his Israelite troops near the valley of Elah. So the Philistines and the Israelites, they faced each other on the opposite hills, with the valley between them. Then Goliath, a Philistine champion from Gath. So a very experienced soldier, been in many shield walls, had warrior type experience. Lots of it. So Goliath, a Philistine champion from Gath, came out of Philistine, ranks to the face of the forces of Israel. He was over 9 feet tall. He wore a bronze helmet, and his bronze coat of mail weighed 125 pounds. Probably more than David weighed. 125 pounds was his armor. He also wore a bronze leg armor, and he carried a bronze javelin on his shoulder. The shaft of his spear was so heavy and thick as a weaver's beam, tipped with an iron spearhead that weighed 15 pounds. Just the spearhead itself weighed 15 pounds. His armor bearer walked ahead of him, carrying his shield. Goliath stood and shouted a taunt across to the Israelites. "Why are you coming out to fight?" he called. "I'm the Philistine champion, but you're only the servants of Saul. Choose one man to come down here and fight me. If he kills me, then we will be your slaves. But if I kill him, you will be our slaves. I defy the armies of Israel today. Send me a man who will fight me." Now when Saul and the Israelites heard this, they were terrified and deeply shaken. That's important. They were terrified and deeply shaken. See, Israel's hope was in their king, King Saul. And also, you need to know, this whole king thing for Israel wasn't God's idea, right? I mean, God had a theocracy in place year prior to all this, where there was God as the king. He had the law, and judges carried that out. The judges that were appointed were the ones that administered the law. That's the way it was. Israel was ahead of its time in that. But Israel wanted a king. They went to Samuel and said, "Hey, everybody has a king. We want a king. We have to have a king." So God went to Samuel and said, "Samuel, they are not rejecting you. They are rejecting me. They are rejecting God. Leave them have a king. But let them know what kings do. They demand things from you. They take land from you. They do what they want because they're king. And kings don't really have laws. Interestingly, if a king broke a law, they changed the law. Because he was king. He was the law. And so Samuel told Israel all that. And they're like, "We want a king anyway. All the cool kids have kings. We want a king." In comes Saul as the king. Saul was terrified. Israel placed its hope in Saul, their king. And now the Philistines were coming out, laying down this, saying, "Hey, we want someone to fight." Israel looked to their king, and they heard crickets. Nothing. In fact, Saul is eerily absent from most of what goes on here. Because Saul was deeply terrified and shaken. He was terrified and shaken. So if you want to be terrified and shaken, you'd be like Saul. Now David was the son of a man named Jesse, and an Ephraimite from Bethlehem in the land of Judah. Jesse was an old man at this point, and at that time he had his 8 sons. Jesse's 3 oldest, Eliab, Abinadab, and Shema, had already joined Saul's army. So they were fighting in Saul's army already to fight the Philistines. The Israelites placed their trust in Saul, their king, and they heard nothing. Saul wasn't going to do anything. Saul didn't know what to do. Saul was afraid. He wasn't going out against that guy. And Saul, for the Israelites, they were looking to their king, but Saul was also head and shoulders above all the other Israelites. He was big. Saul was a big dude. He was head and shoulders above all the other Israelites. So he was tall himself. He was the tallest man the Israelites had. So if you're going to go against Goliath, who are you going to send? Your biggest guy. That was Saul, their king. And he wasn't going anywhere. He wasn't going anywhere because he was terrified, like the rest of Israel was. Next slide, please. David was the youngest son. David's 3 oldest brothers stayed with Saul's army, but David went back and forth so that he could help his father with the sheep in Bethlehem. For 40 days, every morning and evening, the Philistine champion strutted out in front of the Israelite army and shouted his proclamation that we already heard. One day Jesse said to David, "Take this basket of roasted grain to these 10 loaves of bread, and carry them quickly to your brothers, and give these 10 cuts of cheese to their captain. See how your brothers are getting along, and bring back a report on how they are doing." So David's brothers were there with Saul and the Israelite army at the valley of Elah, fighting against the Philistines. So David left the sheep with another shepherd and set out early the next morning with the gifts, as Jesse had directed him. He arrived at the camp just as the Israelite army was leaving for the battlefield with shouts and battle cries. Soon, the Israelites and the Philistine forces stood facing each other for another day. The army against army. David left his things with the keeper of supplies and hurried out to the ranks to greet his brothers. As he was talking with them, Goliath, the Philistine champion from Gath, came out from the Philistine ranks, and that's when David heard him. He shouted the usual taunt to the army of Israel. As soon as the Israelite army saw him, they began to run away in fright. Goliath. "Have you seen the giant?" the men asked. "He comes out each day to defy Israel. The king has offered a huge reward to anyone who kills him. He will give that man one of his daughters for a wife, and the man's entire family will be exempted from paying taxes." One of those things kings can do. David asked the soldier standing nearby, "What will a man get for killing this Philistine?" Now everybody's scared to death. Here's young David, 15 years old. And his question is, what will a man get for killing the Philistine and ending his defiance of Israel? Who is this pagan Philistine anyway, that he is allowed to defy the armies of the living God? See, nobody got that. But David. Goliath was defying the armies of the living God. They all knew what God could do, the Israelites. They knew what he could do. David knew what he would do. He knew what he would do. And he was fearless because of it. And these men gave David the same reply. They said, "Yes, that is the reward for killing him." They repeated what we had just heard. Next slide, please. So Saul sends for this boy, David. Saul, expecting the man who was saying he would take on David to be an experienced soldier. When Saul saw David, he was like, "You're a 15-year-old boy. You've never been in a shield wall. You've never fought anybody. You understand, Goliath is an experienced warrior. And he's 9.5 foot tall. And you, David, are but a boy. Don't worry, said David, about this Philistine, as David told Saul. I will go fight him. Don't be ridiculous, Saul replied. There's no way you can fight this Philistine and possibly win. You are only a boy, and he's been a man of war since his youth. But David persisted. I have been taking care of my father's sheep and goats, he said. When a lion or a bear comes to steal the lamb of the flock, I go after it with a club and rescue the lamb from its mouth. If the animal turns on me, I catch it by the jaw and club it to death. I have done this to both lion and bears, and I'll do it to this pagan Philistine too. For, this is important, for he has defied the armies of the living God. The Lord who rescued me from the claws of the lion and of the bear will rescue me from this Philistine.
Amen.
David knew God could do anything. But he knew what God would do.
Amen.
He knew what God would do. Next slide. David had trust in the true king. Everyone else had trust in their king, Saul, who did nothing. But David had trust in the King of Kings, the Lord of Lords. That's where he placed his trust. In God. He had a clarity about this. He was very clear on this throughout his entire life. Yes, he messed up in his life. Yes, there were consequences. There are consequences for sin. There is. Every sin has consequences, and if David were here today, he would tell you that. Every sin has consequences. And if we have time, we'll talk a little bit about David's consequences, because he had them. There's consequences for every sin. But David had clarity. He had a clarity about who God was. God was the King of Kings. Saul was a king. David would become a king. But David would never forget who the King of Kings was. Where did that get him? Probably the greatest king that Israel ever had. David put his trust in the true king. Next slide, please. Back to, this. David wrote this, by the way, Psalms 25, 1 through 2, written by David's hand. O Lord, I give my life to you. I trust in you, my God. Can you imagine every day if we wake up and this is the first thing we say? Oh Lord, I give my life to you. I trust in you, my God. I'm sure David repeated this when he was going to battle Goliath. Oh Lord, I give my life to you. I trust in you, my God. Written by David's hand. Psalms 25, 1 and 2. O Lord, I give my life to you. I trust in you, my God. That's where my trust is. That's where my focus is. I know you can do anything, but what's more than that? I know you will. I know you will. Next slide, please. Back to the story. Saul finally consented. All right, go ahead, he said, and may the Lord be with you, because I won't be. Frightened Saul. May the Lord be with you. I'm out of here. I'll be in the back. Then Saul gave David his own armor, a bronze helmet and a coat of mail. David put it on, strapped on the sword over it, and he took a step or two to see what it was like, for he had never worn such things before. I can't go in these, he protested to Saul. I'm not used to them. So David took them off. And he picked up 5 smooth stones from a stream and put them into a shepherd's bag. And then, armed only with his shepherd's staff and his sling, he started across the valley to fight the Philistine. Can you imagine Goliath when David was coming towards him? Could you imagine the laughter from the Philistine camps? Like, seriously? We've got Goliath here, 9.5 foot tall, whose spear is probably heavier than David, who's coming out here. Not only does he not have any armor, he doesn't have any weapons. We got this, guys. Are the saying the Philistines. I mean, the Philistines aren't afraid at this point. For the wrong reason. See, the Philistines' hope is in Goliath, who they're sure has got this one. Their hope is in Goliath, and Goliath's hope is in Goliath. Because Goliath knows he's 9.5 foot tall, and David's not. There's no fear on their camp. Goliath walked out toward David with his shield bearer ahead of him, sneering in contempt at this ruddy-faced boy. Am I a dog, he roared at David, that you come to me with a stick? Not that David had a stick, because he didn't, but David was such a non-threat. He roared at David that you come to me with a stick, and he cursed David by the names of his gods, whoever they were. Come over here, and I, says Goliath, I will give your flesh to the birds and wild animals, Goliath yelled. So Goliath roared. And David replied. 15-year-old boy replied to the giant when no one else would. When no one else could, because they were terrified. And they had something to be terrified of. They did. So did David. David had a lot to be terrified of in this moment. But he was fearless. David was fearless. And here's what he said. David replied to the Philistine, you come to me with sword, spear, and javelin. But I come to you in the name of the Lord's heaven's armies, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. Whom you have defied. Whom you have defied. So David reminds Goliath of what he did. You defied the living God. That was your big mistake. You defied the living God. He didn't say, I'm taking you out. He said, you defied the living God. And then he continues. Today, the Lord Notice he didn't say, David. He didn't say, today I will. That's not there. Because he didn't say it. Because it wasn't there. It wasn't in his heart. It wasn't in his mind. It just wasn't there. David was not about to take on Goliath. David was a 15-year-old boy. David could not take on Goliath, but David knew who could. But what's more important than that? David knew who would.
Amen.
He knew who would. David replied to the Philistine, "You come to me with sword, spear, javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord's heaven's armies, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. Today, the Lord will conquer you. The Lord will conquer you, and I will kill you, and I will cut off your head. And then I will give the dead bodies of your men to the birds and wild animals, and the whole world will know that there is a God in Israel. And everyone assembled here will know that the Lord rescues his people, but not with the sword and spear. This is the Lord's battle." This is the Lord's battle. And he will give you to us. This is what David said to Goliath. 15-year-old David said this to Goliath. This is the Lord's battle. He will give you to us. As Goliath moved closer to attack, David didn't run away. He ran up to me. You're coming to attack me? I'm coming to greet you. Because I know what God can do.
Amen.
But what's more important than that? I know what God will
Will do.
Okay. So reaching into the shepherd's bag, taking out a stone, he hurled it with his sling, hit the Philistine in the forehead. The stone sank into Goliath's head. He stumbled and fell face down on the ground. Now, David didn't do that. Yes, he chucked the stone. But to have the stone hit Goliath exactly where it hit Goliath and sink into his forehead, that was God. David triumphed over the Philistine with only a sling and a stone, for he had no sword. He didn't even have a sword. Not like he had a sword and could use it next, right? Don't we all like to do that? We like to go into battle with everything and be like, well, if this doesn't work, I'll use this. If that doesn't work, I'll use this. If that doesn't work, I've got this. And, I've got that, and none of that works. He had nothing else. Then David ran over, pulled Goliath's sword from its sheath, and David used it to kill him and cut off his head. When the Philistines saw that their champion was dead, they did the worst thing they could possibly do. They turned and ran. And now the Israelite army pursued them. Then the men of Israel and Judah, who were no longer afraid, gave a great shout of triumph and rushed after the Philistines, chasing them as far as Gath and the gates of Ekron. The bodies of the dead and wounded Philistines were strewn all along the ground. Because their hope was in Goliath, who is now dead. Goliath is dead, killed by David, so David became the most feared, dare we call him a man, as far as the Philistines were concerned. David was feared greatly. Next slide. David saw clearly. He was never confused about who was king. We need to see clearly. We should never be confused about who is king. David was never confused. King of kings, Lord of lords, David knew who it was. He saw with a clarity that no one else had at that time. He had the clarity. And he acted confidently. David's actions were decisive. He threw that stone, running toward the enemy. He wasn't running away from the enemy. He knew what God could do. He knew what God would do. He acted confidently. We need to act confidently because we know what God can do. And hopefully we know what God will do. What God will do. Next slide. David also walked humbly. David knew he couldn't do what he did, but he knew who could do what needed to be done. And that wasn't just with Goliath. That was with the bear and he said, the Lord, the God who rescued me from the paw of the bear and the paw of the lion, he is the one who will rescue me from Goliath as well. He never said, well, David, I did this and I did that, so I can do that. No, God did this, God did that, so God can do this. He knew what God could do, but he also knew what God would do, and that's so important. That is mind-bending. That is so different than what the world is trying to tell us. David knew he couldn't do it, but he knew who could, and even more, he knew who would, and he walked humbly in it for the rest of his life. Never did David lose that clarity. Yeah, he screwed up. But he knew. He had clarity. He had clarity. He knew who the King of Kings was. Every day. Next slide. David's popularity grew because of what had happened. But David's skill as a warrior also grew. As David grew up, he became a great warrior. Young David. A great warrior. And Saul's animosity for David, well, that also grew. Saul, who was once kind of happy with David because of what David did, killing Goliath and all that, and he played music for, David played music for Saul and calmed him and this and that, but Saul's animosity grew for David because David became a great warrior. And David still had his clarity. And so Saul, as his animosity grew, he wanted to kill David. Wanted to kill him. David knew it. So David ran. Uh-oh, fear! David's running! And he did. And he was. But you know what? David didn't fear Saul. David was not running from Saul because he feared him. How do I know that? I read the Bible.
Amen.
Next slide, please. 1 Samuel 18, 5 and 7. Whatever Saul asked David to do, David did it successfully. So Saul made him commander over the men of war, an appointment that was welcomed by the people and Saul's officers alike. When the victorious Israelite army was returning home after David had killed the Philistine, women from all over the towns of Israel came out to meet King Saul, and they sang and danced with joy, tambourines and cymbals. And this was their song. Saul has killed his thousands. David his tens of thousands. So Saul didn't like that. I don't. Next slide, please. So Saul tries to kill David. That's Saul in the back, because Saul is king. David in the forefront. Here, growing up, now a young man. No longer a boy. But still with clarity. Saul tries to kill David. David flees. With his men. He's got some men now that hang with him. David flees from Saul. And everybody thinks David's afraid. David doesn't want to meet Saul. And he didn't. David did not want to come up against Saul. Because David did not want to kill Saul. He did not. David didn't fear Saul. He feared God. David feared God. See, David knew you shouldn't fear anything but God, and we know we should fear everything but God. At least that's the way a lot of us act, right? We're not worried about God. God's going to forgive us. I don't fear God, right? Really? David feared God. He didn't fear anything else, but he feared God. And so he did not want to touch Saul. In fact, he had opportunities to take Saul out. Next slide.
Yes.
This is Saul. This is David after he cut a piece of Saul's robe. And he showed it to him. Said, see, I could have taken you out, but I didn't. Now David's men that were around him, they're like, David, let me do it. You don't do it. I understand, David, you can't take King Saul out, but I can. Here's the sword. Let me run it through him. I'll pin him to the ground. Saul was sleeping on the ground, and David and his men were standing right over the top of him. They had walked through the Saul's army, walked through it right up to the camp, right in front of them. And David's buddies are like, let me kill him, David. Let me drive it right through him. It won't be you, it'll be me. Let me do it. And David said, no, it's not for us to do. That man was king because God put him there. Saul was king because God made him king. David feared God and only God, and was not going to take King Saul out of the picture. Even if it would have hastened him to be king. Now he was anointed king but didn't know it. But at this point, with his popularity, he could have assumed it. This could be happening. But rather than take out Saul, David says, no, it's not for me to do. Saul will not die by my hand and by my men who David had around him. David refuses to harm Saul. But he let Saul know it. Said, Saul, by the way, could have killed you. Didn't. I fear God. I fear God. Next slide. David knew this. And we all need to grasp this. this is important stuff. David knew it's God's will. David knew it's God's way. David knew it's God's timing.
Amen.
It's God's will, it's God's way, it's God's timing. David knew that. It's God's will, it's God's way, it's God's timing. You want to know what David knew? That's what David knew. It's God's will, it's God's way, it's God's timing. So if I take you out, it's David's timing. It's God's will, it's God's way, it's God's timing. So if you're writing stuff down, write this down.
Amen.
This will change your life. Change David's. Change David's. Now, David was fearless. But why was David fearless? He was fearless because of
He's trusting God.
his trust in God. He knew God can do everything. We all know that. But we've got to take it to the next step, the next level. We need to know that God will. God will. Not only can God, God will. It's God's will. It's God's way. It's God's timing. Next slide. David never made the mistake of placing his hope in himself. Saul did it. Saul put his hope in himself. Goliath did it. Goliath put his hope in himself. How'd that end for them? David never made the mistake of placing his hope in himself. Now, he made mistakes, but he never made the mistake of placing his hope in himself. Psalm 25:1, penned by David. In you, Lord my God, I put my trust. That's where my trust is. Your hope is where your trust is. Your heart is where your trust is. What do you trust? In you, Lord my God, I put my trust. There's your trust. Your trust is in you, my Lord, my God. In you I put my trust. Every day. It'll be God's will. It'll be God's way. It'll be God's timing. God's will, God's way, God's timing. David had that clarity, and he never forgot it. Not for the rest of his days. What do I have after this? Next slide.
That's the end.
That's the end! Hold on, it's not the end. That's the end. I have a few minutes, I think. So, David made a few mistakes. Okay, they were dastardly mistakes. Having someone killed, but, and David covered it up, which is kind of silly because he was king. He could have done it in the open, But David knew it was wrong, so he tried to cover it up. But David, even though he sinned in a horrible way, he could have done it openly and nobody would have said a word because he was king. He was allowed to kill whoever he wanted to kill. He was allowed to make any laws he wanted to make. But David never would change the laws from God's laws. Always kept it the same, even though those very laws convicted him. Never would allow them to be changed. Those laws that he stood by, God's laws, convicted him. They broke him. He stood by them. They broke him. But he always had clarity. He paid a great price. We know he slept with Bathsheba. He had her husband Uriah killed. Horrible thing. The There's consequences for your sin. Now, David never lost his kingdom because David had that clarity of who God was, King of Kings, Lord of Lords. David's daughter was raped. David's daughter was raped by David's son. That son of David's murdered David's firstborn. Murdered him after he raped his daughter. Murdered an heir to the throne because he wanted to be king. And it gets worse. Then he went after David because he wanted to be king. David's son went after David. Can you imagine that? Your son trying to kill you? David knew he was coming after him. And he fled. David fled. He went out of the kingdom, left it all. Fled with his men, but he fled. Was David finally afraid? No. David wasn't afraid. David wasn't running because he was afraid. David was running because he wanted to honor God. He didn't want to confront what he had to confront. It was his son. David fled. Well, guess what? His son followed him with his army. His son wasn't happy just occupying the palace. His son wanted his dad dead. And his son lost sight of who his dad was. David's men that were supporting and around David were highly trained, skilled warriors. And David's son's army that he had were younger guys, and they ran right into the woods after David and his men. David divided his men into 3 groups. He set up 3 commanders, and he said to each one, do not kill my son. Do not kill my son. Do not kill my son. He's trying to kill me. I don't want you to kill him. Now, David's son did die in that battle. So David lost another son. There's consequences for sin. Every sin has a consequence. It does. You're not going to get away from it. No matter who you are, sin carries consequences. Ask David. He will tell you. Sin has consequences. But you know what else he would tell you? If David were right here today, you know what he would tell you? He would tell you not to fear. Because God can. More importantly, God will. It's God's way. It's God's will. And it's God's timing.
Amen.
That's what David would tell you. That's what David's telling you. It's God's will. It's God's way. It's God's timing. God can. God will. Be fearless
Amen.
today. Be fearless today.